5th, 1956. This interview is being conducted by Kenneth and June Hunter. Please tell us your full name and when and where you were born.
Robert Edward Barron, Woodhaven, New York. Woodhaven is part of Queens, New York City.
And when were you born?
March 25th, 1930.
And what did you do before you entered the Army?
I was a student at the New York State College for Teachers, Albany, New York.
Now, did you enlist or were you drafted?
I was drafted. I had been postponed during my time in school, and when I finished, they said, "Okay, come." And in the meantime, one of my friends from Long Island had been commissioned in the Air Force and was trying to get me to go into the Air Force. And I thought, that sounds pretty good. So I was investigating being an officer in the Air Force when the Army said, "No, we have prior claim, you come." So I went for induction.
And where did you go for that induction?
New York City. And this is Korean War times, and they were still desperate for people. So they did my physical and said, well, if you go lie down for a while, maybe your blood pressure will go down. And, So after about a half hour, they came in and tested me again. Yes, well, all right, I think you're in. And so I was in. And I went to Camp Kilmer and processed there. And then I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, the E Company 69th Infantry Regiment for 16 weeks of basic infantry training.
And do you remember any of the special things you did during basic training?
Legally or illegally?
Oh, a little bit of both. I want to say.
Well, basic training was Korean War, and we were taught how to kill and how to survive yourself, which was useful information. And we had a normal sergeant who drilled us, and for about the first, 8 weeks, we were kept pretty close to the barracks. But once they slipped the reins on us, I wandered around. And at this point, I had gotten my degree as a librarian, wandered over to the post. It was a branch of the post service club in the 69th Infantry area. So I wandered in there, and they were looking for help. And so I said, okay, and the lieutenant talked to me and hired me to work nights. Now, at this point in basic training, as I say, we had a little freedom, but the sergeant still was the one who dictated your day. And we had my first day of work, the sergeant decided we were going to have a toothbrush party that night, which is a real scrub down of the barracks. And I said, "But Sergeant, I have to go to work." And he looked at me, he said, "What do you mean you have to go to work?" I said, "Well, I'm due over at the service club to run the library." He said, "No, you're not." I said, "Oh, yes, I am." And I said, "Lieutenant," and I can't tell you who the lieutenant was, but the lieutenant's going to be unhappy if I don't show up. So he talked to the lieutenant, and maybe he didn't talk to the lieutenant. Maybe he decided a lieutenant would talk to him. I don't know. But anyway, I went to the service club and did the library. And the only really thing I remember about that is I earned more money working as a librarian off-duty, night, Saturday, something like that, than I made in my month of Army pay. And at the end of that also, about, I don't know, I mean, we had the normal bayonet training and shooting. I managed to hit a target, so they didn't throw me out. I wasn't a sharpshooter, but I did qualify as a rifleman. And the one incident that I strongly remember was about halfway through. It was Easter weekend, and they gave almost all of us passes. Now, at that time, I was going with a girl from Yonkers, New York, and I went home to spend the weekend with Joan. And as being Easter, we were going to church on Sunday. Now, why, I have no idea, but the only civilian clothes that I had at Joan's house was a summer suit. And Easter that year was very early, probably end of March, very early April, and it was cold. So I thought, okay, I'll wear my suit. And it had been one thing that had been really pounded into us is when we were allowed in civilian clothes, is you do not mix civilian and army clothes. Okay? So I think I've got a summer suit, it's cold, and the only coat I own is an army overcoat. So I am going to carry this army overcoat, and if it gets real cold, I'm going to put it on regardless. I mean, who's going to know? Who's going to see me? So I have the coat over my arm. I come out of church, and the minister greets us, welcome. Oh, good to see you. How are things at Fort Dix? Uh-oh. And then I thought, gee, this guy has got the most marvelous memory. I mean, he only met me in December when I was here at Christmas time, and he remembers I'm in the Army at Fort Dix. Wait a minute. In December, you weren't in the Army. How did he know I was in the Army at Fort Dix? So I said, how did you know I was at Fort Dix? He said, that patch on your Army sleeve is the 69th Infantry Division, and they're headquartered at 1st Army at Fort Dix. I said, oh, how do you know that? He said, I'm a chaplain, lieutenant colonel in the reserves, and I laid out all of the chaplains, all the chapels at Fort Dix. Okay. So I went back, I finished my basic. I was getting close to the end of it. And someplace, those things that you don't remember but stick in your mind. When I had been in library school, Robert Burgess, who was the dean of the library school, said to us one day, because we had a lot of men in that class, if you're ever stationed in the Army, you should try to get stationed at Fort Slocum. It's the showplace of the 1st Army headquarters. And, in and out one ear. So here we are on a Friday afternoon, getting a lecture on why we should re-up. And we could go to the school of our choice. And I sat through it. Yes, I'm about to re-up, of course. Yeah. Let's see, I've got 19 months and 6 days or something, left to go. And that was, but one of the things that he was rattling off in the schools you could go to was the TIE School at Fort Slocum. Fort Slocum. I've heard of that someplace, but I don't know why. So I went off for the weekend, and this was the Easter weekend. And so after the minister said to me, he said, you should try to get stationed at Fort Slocum. It would be closer to home. Now, when Bob Burgess had told me about this, I thought Fort Slocum was in the state of Washington. Okay, Washington's a lot closer than Korea, and this was Korean War days, but it's still not what I'd call close to home. So I commented on this, and the minister looked at me and said, Fort Slocum is in New Rochelle Harbor. Now, Joan lived in Yonkers, and New Rochelle butts up against Yonkers. I said, oh, Fort Slocum, TIG School. You enlist. It might be worth it. So I went back on Monday, and I saw my friendly sergeant. And I said, did you really, really mean that if we enlist, we can go to the school of our choice? Oh, yes, I promise you, anything, anything. Just re-up, I said, I can go to TIG school at Fort. Oh, yes, yes. I said, okay, I'll do it. So it sort of floored them. I don't think anybody else had sort of said yes, they could, it would. And so they sent me down to be processed for the TIG school. And they had to give me a physical. Now, I'm already in the Army, but I had to get a physical to be able to enlist in the Army. And I couldn't pass the physical. So they thought about this for a while and fudged this, that, and the other thing. And finally, one thing I could not pass was the hearing test. And they said, well, if you're going to the TIG school, TIG is Troop Information and Education, and I had figured as a teacher possibly I might be able to do that. So I said, oh, I'm sorry, you can't pass this. Well, it also things, one time they had said, what about officer candidate school? And I had said, okay, I'll do that, So they sent me down for that. And they asked, well, are you allergic to anything? And I said, yes. And I said, I'm allergic to hay fever, grass, cut things. So just to be sure that I was actually allergic to that, they give you a series of 22 shots. Now, the theory being that if you're allergic, you might turn red or something around the place of injection. My bumps were pushing the needles out. I passed out. When I came back to consciousness, I've got a whole group of people staring at me, saying, you have the most amazing reaction of anybody we've ever tested here. Of course, you realize this immediately eliminates you from being an officer. So that was the first time I couldn't pass the test. Now they're saying I can't enlist in the Army because I can't hear. I said, well, let me out of there. Oh, no, you're in the Army. We can't let you out. But you can't re-enlist. Then, what again? You're going to the TIG school. Well, you probably don't have to hear to be an educator. All right, you can do it. So I got my discharge on July 3rd. And I was supposed to report to Fort Slocum on July 5th. And I must admit that I sat there on July 4th looking at an honorable discharge in my hand saying, do I really want to go up there for 3 years? Yes, you said you would, so you will. So I looked at my orders to go to Fort Slocum, to the TIG school, and some clerk typist had typed PI school. I figured typical clerk typist. Now, I was a clerk typist too, when I wasn't doing anything else at Fort Dix and the Army line. So I got to Fort Slocum, which is an island in New Rochelle Harbor, David's Island. And the guards at the gate, looked at it and said, okay, up the hill there. And they didn't question my orders at all. So I went in and I was processed. And over the weekend, I'm wandering around the post. Now, this is the place that Bob Burgess has told me is the show place of First Army. And I wandered into the post library, and it was the saddest place I have looked at. And I'm thinking, Bob thinks this is the best thing in First Army. Either First Army is pretty horrible, or, things have gone downhill since he was here. But anyway, there it was, and there was a sergeant on duty. And the sergeant was anything but happy. He was a little drunk, but one never drinks on duty, so I knew that that couldn't possibly be the cause. Oh, this is terrible, this is terrible. I'll do anything to get out of here. I'll take permanent KP for life to get out of this job, And I'm thinking, all right. I said, Sergeant, you really, really don't like this job? Oh, I hate it, I hate it. I'll do anything to get out of here. I said, I'll take your job. You will? So he runs over and he gets a lieutenant. Lieutenant, this guy'll take my job. So the lieutenant interviewed me. I said, well, I'll certainly work on this. And so that was the weekend. And then I started my classes, and every morning we would fall out at someplace in the early morning hours, and down the street a block. This island looks like a college campus with 3-story big stone buildings stretched out on one side, and officers' quarters and all, and the classes on the end. And, I didn't pay any attention to those guys down there. I don't know what they were, who they are, but they weren't pertaining to me, so I didn't bother. And also being a private who had just been trained by a good sergeant that when I say jump, the question is how high, not anything else, and don't ask questions about anything else. So I didn't pay any attention. And I sat in class and I took my notes and I listened. And about the third day, the knock comes on the door and the first sergeant says, report to my office. And I thought, okay, so I got in there. And he started chewing me up one side and down the other as to what I thought I was doing and why hadn't I been in class yet. And if I didn't like his island, I could get off it immediately. And I'm thinking, am I dreaming? What's going on? I haven't missed a class. I wouldn't dare miss a class. I'm a private. And finally he kept talking about P.I., I'm in T.I.E. And I said, I don't care what you think you're in my P.I. and either get there or... So I said, well, okay, if that's my choice, I'll go.
What does that stand for, those letters?
You'll
tell
I'll get to that. Okay. But anyway, so he says, good, over there, which happened to be the guys the block down, that I hadn't paid any attention to. So I have no idea of what the PI school is. But I figured it's on Fort Slocum, and let's see what it is before I leave it. So I moved all my gear down to the next barracks and went in and ran into 2 guys that I had known from basic training. And it was a 4-man room, and they said, oh, we got a bunk in here. Come on in and join us. I said, okay. I said, by the way, what is PI? Oh, that's public information, like public relations. I said, I can do that. And so I went to the PI school, and I graduated from the PI school. Well, in the meantime, about the first or second day of class, when I'd had an assignment, I discovered there was another library on the island besides the information one over here at the service club. There was the information school library, and it was a beautiful place. It had windows out on Long Island Sound. It had leather furnishings, all the couches, the chairs, tables. And when I got talking with the library director, she was begging for help. Well, in the meantime, I had heard from the lieutenant that I had originally talked to. He said, "Oh, I got word back from First Army. You're essential personnel at Fort Dix, and you will be returned to Fort Dix when you get done with your schooling." Now, one of the reasons I had enlisted was not only to go to Fort Slocum, but was to get out of Fort Dix. And I thought, well, from the firing pan to the fire, I've done it. So I'm explaining to Mrs. McCarthy, who was a civilian, that as much as I'd like to work there, I had just been told by the lieutenant over at the service club, who had tried to get me to be the librarian there, that I was going back to Fort Dix. And she said, "Lieutenant Colonel von Voigtlander runs this place. Let me talk to him." And Lieutenant Colonel von Voigtlander didn't ask First Army if he could have me. He told First Army he was going to have me when I finished training. And so when I finished my training, I became the librarian at Fort Dix, at Fort Slocum. And I was very happy there. It was a civilian job. I mean, I was wearing a uniform, but Armed Forces Information School drew the elite of all of the services. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the enlisted men and the officers were really top-notch. So it was a nice place to be, and I liked working there. And Evelyn, after a while, said to me, she says, "No, I'm thinking of retiring. Why don't you take over as director, and I'll be the assistant director in a couple of years, so when you're finished training, your enlistment, you take over as director here." And I thought, "No, Evelyn, that will not work. You are a civilian. You have a rank, civilian equivalent rank of probably a captain or so. I am a private, and I'm not going to be able to do what you do." So I said, I may be running this place, but your name is going to be on the thing. And so that was the way we worked it. Well, one of the things that came up in this time was we had a clerk, a librarian, not a clerk, she was a librarian, in charge of periodicals. And it suddenly became a civil service job. Well, it had always been a civil service, but civil service started cracking down, saying you must take the test to pass and get this job. And Thelma was one of those people that if you asked her name on a test, she couldn't even tell you her name. And Thelma took the test 3 times and failed it. And civil service came to Mrs. McCarthy, who turned it over to me and said, "You've got to get rid of Thelma." I said, "I don't want to get rid of Thelma. Thelma is a crackerjack librarian. I don't care if she can't pass a test. Everything else she knows and knows well." So I said, "Thelma," the civil service cracked down on me again. I had a long interview with them. So I said, "Thelma, I hate to tell you this, but I've got to let you go." I said, "I don't want to do it." I said, "You are a fine librarian." So she said, "Okay, let me think about it." So Thelma went home and did a little investigation and discovered she could enlist in the WACs and be a commissioned officer. Thelma was commissioned a first or second lieutenant, I don't remember which. And there's a military tradition that the first enlisted person who salutes a new officer gets $1. So Thelma was commissioned her officer. I turned around and saluted her, and she handed me my $1, and we went right on working as we had been, Thelma doing her job, now as a lieutenant. And this went on for, well, I guess as long as I was still there. After that, she was transferred out to another place, married a superior officer, and raised children thereafter. But that was life at Fort Slocum. And like almost in any library, they hate to get rid of a book. I mean, a book is sacred. But sometimes they wear out, they get dated. And we had books that really were out of date. But First Army regulations had so much paperwork to, you want to stop that?
We were talking about the First Army regulations.
All right, so what we decided we would do, since there was so much paperwork to try and get rid of a book, that when we worked nights, and the library was open from, I guess it was 8 in the morning till 9 at night. As I say, this is an island in the New Rochelle Harbor, only reachable by ferry. So each night, Evelyn or I, when we left after working at night, would take a book or so with us, and we'd stand on the back of the ferry, look around, and very quietly drop the books over the edge of the boat. And that was the only way we could get rid of them. Well, I was there for a year and a half, 2 years. And why, I don't know, I've never yet figured out this one, but a major in the public information courses had orders to go to Germany. And I had helped him with some assignments and his research. And he kept talking about, wouldn't I like to go to Europe with him? And I kept telling him, no, I would not. I mean, why should I go to Germany where I had heard that they did nasty things like sleeping out in the field and not in a nice barracks? And here I was, and I had gotten married right after I graduated from PI training. And so I went home to my wife, on the 5 o'clock ferry. And I kept saying, no, I don't want to go to Europe. Well, you might end up in a FECOM levy. Well, FECOM is Far Eastern Command, and this is still Korean War days. And I'm thinking, as long as Colonel von Voigtlander is here, I don't think I'm going to FECOM. So I kept saying, no thank you, no thank you. And this went on over a period of several months. And all of a sudden, one day, there was a First Army General Levy. A General Levy is looking for a warm body. Basically, all they want is a warm body. But once in a while, they'll tack on a couple of specifications with it. And this one was for an enlisted man, must be at least the following rank, must have at least the following time left in service, which just happened to match my qualifications to the, dot at the end of the comma, saying this, this, and this. And it also said the ability to speak Spanish. Now this is for an assignment to Germany. And by the time, and they were still using in those days a key sort punch thing, and when they ran all the cards through, lo and behold, only one card came up, mine. And after that, Major Logan came in and he said, "Oh, I hear you got orders to Germany." I looked at him and I said, "Why did you go to all of this trouble?" And I said, why? I said, "I told you I don't want to go." "Oh, you'll like it over there." And I don't think I'll like it. But Army regulations being Army regulations, I went. And so I went back and was processed and shipped out of Brooklyn Harbor on the USS Geiger, a troop ship. And it was the roughest crossing of the year. We had a couple of broken legs and things from people being thrown against a bulkhead. My duty on this was to be on the fantail deck for a couple of hours, and if anybody went overboard, I was supposed to yell, "Man overboard." And we had 2 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. And as I say, it was a rough crossing, and I will always remember turning away from the serving line one morning with my tray of oatmeal and things, and we had a wave. And that oatmeal just went up in very slow. I could see exactly who it was going to hit, but, I couldn't do anything about it. And, we were sleeping in on canvas bunks, I don't know, 4 high or something down in the hold. And, but still it wasn't a bad trip. But I kept thinking, one of these days I'd like to do this on a decent ship. So we crossed the Mediterranean, and I still am not sure of my geography, but it seems to me the equator is south of where we were. And maybe they just had nothing to do, they were stalling or wanted to do something. But anyway, we crossed the equator. And we had a crossing the equator celebration with all of the nonsense. And then we landed in Casablanca. And I remember that so because it was my birthday. I was a 25-year-old, very naive, and I had never been out of the United States, Canada. And I just think I am walking down the streets of Morocco, because they gave us leave. And here I am in Casablanca, and I saw snake charmers, the beautiful mosaic work that they do there. And then got back on my ship. We'd unloaded some people there. Then we went on through the Mediterranean, through Gibraltar, and they woke us up at midnight saying, "If you want to see Gibraltar, there it is." We landed at Livorno, Italy, and they said, "Okay, you're off, Livorno." So I reported in, and they said, "Well, what are you doing here?" "I don't know. I'm on orders." "Well, we've got some opening over at the Stars and Stripes, which is the paper published for the U.S. forces overseas." So I worked on the Stars and Stripes for a short while and got to see how that worked. And then they said, "Well, the Adjutant General's coming and we're overstrength with you. We've really got to let you go, We're going to put you back in the pipeline." I mean, Austria, I was assigned to. Now, back in the days when Major Logan was talking, he wanted me to go to Germany, but my orders read Austria. And I said, okay, something else. And but I wasn't about to tell somebody. I think I'm here at the specific request of a major. And so I went up from Livorno to Austria. And I got to Austria, and they said, why are you here? I said, I don't know. Well, we have an opening at Riedenburg. You can work on the local paper there, which I don't even remember now what it was. But I worked on that for a short time. And they said, the Adjutant General's coming by and you're overstrength on our organization chart. You know, we've got to let you go. Okay, send me back to the U.S. You know, oh, we can't do that. So I said, okay. So I said, well, there's an opening over at the headquarters company for the Austrian Area Command. So I reported over there, and they said, oh, well, we were expecting a major. I said, oh. Well, do you think you could do the job? It's Public Information Director for the Austrian Area Command. I said, yes. So I became the Director of Public Information for the Austrian Area Command. And at this point, I was with the S2 G2 office, which is the intelligence unit. You've got PIOS, Personnel Intelligence Operations and Supply. And I realized two things. Number one, this is 10 years after the end of the war, and we have never signed a peace treaty with Germany. I didn't believe it. And so they said, okay. And then the second one was, we are going to cut off dependents coming to the command on the 1st of July. My wife was a teacher in New Rochelle and was booked to come over on the USS America, arriving in Livorno, Italy in July. And I realized that if she wasn't there by the 30th of June, she wasn't going to come in as a dependent. Nor was I allowed to say anything about this because it was classified information. So I wrote to her and told her how much I loved her and how much I missed her and how I wished so strongly that she would just get over here immediately. And she read between the lines and came. And she managed to make it, I think, on June 29th. So, in the meantime, I had seen a lieutenant who'd just gotten his orders back to the States, that he had a private apartment in one of the residences just a half a block from where my office was. So I went and asked, and I discovered that, yeah, this woman would rent to me, and it was going to be a push, but I could squeeze it out on my well, let's see, at this time I'm up to a corporal, because I've been in for a couple of years. And so I would make do. And she came, well, I had never flown overseas. I had no idea the stress of it. And she was flying in. We had bought luggage for her before I left. And we had a couple of very large, sturdy suitcases that we figured a stevedore throwing around on the dock, you know, was fine. And, when she flew over, she had something like 40 pounds weight. And they did not classify what you wore as part of your weight allowance. So she had about 4 layers of clothing on. She had a straw basket, a handbag. She had things pinned all over that. And I had a big bouquet of flowers for her. I had booked the best restaurant in Salzburg, where we were stationed. And she got off a KLM flight at Salzburg. And I said, here's flowers. Now we're going to dinner. She says, should we go to bed, or anything? And I had no idea. Well, she'd been in transit for like 24 hours or something between changing planes, and I had 3 or 4 weeks to come over, and I was real rested. So anyway, she didn't quite appreciate it, but the thought was there. And we did this. So I had 32 units under me as in the Austrian Area Command. And I used to make a circle, visiting all of them, seeing how they were doing, giving them suggestions, things to do. And all of them were enlisted men, with the exception of 1 unit. And I had a first lieutenant in charge of that PO. And he didn't always take too kindly to my suggestions. In fact, he thought sometimes they were commands, and he wasn't about to take a command from a corporal. So I went back and I told my boss, I've got a problem out here with this unit and this lieutenant. And he thought for a minute. He said, Lieutenant. He said, a captain outranks a lieutenant. Now, I had been dreaming of, all these movies where you get battlefield commissions and all. So I'm thinking, yes, a captain. Oh, good, I'm going to get a rank of captain. And so he said, yes, from now on, Captain Clock will sign all of your orders. I said, yes, sir. Well, I didn't know there was actually a Captain Clock. I mean, I thought I was Captain Clock until I discovered one day that I wasn't. And so anyway, then from then on, all the orders that went out of my office were signed by Captain Clock. And this lieutenant pretty much guessed that I was really pulling his leg. But he checked up and he discovered, yes, there was a Captain Clock at headquarters. And so he didn't question it again. And I also had one fellow there, I knew. And the next thing I knew, the Russians had agreed to our peace treaty. Well, before I took this job, actually, let me back up. Before I took this job in Salzburg, I had also heard there was an opening for somebody in Vienna. And they said, why don't you go out and look at the job in Vienna? Vienna has always been my city of love. I have always dreamed of going to Vienna. And I thought, I'm going to be able to work and live in Vienna. This is too much. So I went to Vienna to look at this job. And I was interviewed, and after the interview, I'm wandering around Vienna, gawking at this, that, and the other thing, not paying any attention. Now, Vienna was divided in 4 zones of occupation. The U.S. zone, the British zone, the Russian zone, and the French zone. And all of a sudden, I hear this very loud bark at me. And I didn't understand what he was saying, but I turned around and looked, and I am looking down a rifle held by a very large brown soldiered officer with a red star on him. I had wandered into the Russian zone, and he was sort of telling me, no, you don't come in here. And I thought, well, if this is the way they treat you in Vienna, I don't want to work in Vienna. So I went back and took the job in Salzburg. and decided and Salzburg is the most beautiful city I know of. I love it there. And the one thing that amazed me, though, about my time in Austria was some of the U.S. soldiers that were in the barracks there before I moved out to the headquarters, who would spend their entire weekend just in the barracks doing nothing. And they didn't want to see anything around. And I couldn't believe, here you've got this opportunity to see another land, to see a country, how people live, and you want to stay in this dump of a barracks. It was a very nice barracks, I grant, but still, I mean, as you know, I just couldn't believe it. So when we were there, and after Joan came over, every weekend that we could, we went someplace. Some of our friends over there who had been there longer than we had cars, and we would go up to Birch's Garden for the weekend. We would go someplace else. There was a sergeant who liked things that I liked. He had a car. And I did not really know the economy that such. In the office, I had a German secretary and an American secretary. If my calls had to be made to something in Austria, my Austrian secretary, you know, did it. So German, she was a native. If it was the rest of the thing, the American girl did all the calls. And this one weekend, we had a classmate, roommate of mine, who was with Shape headquarters in Paris. Now, Eddie had always loved Paris. Paris to him was heaven. And so when he heard he was going to be assigned to Paris, he thought it was wonderful. I had been corresponding since I was 16 years old with a girl in Denmark that I had never met. And I'd given Ed her name. And so one weekend, he'd gone up to Copenhagen, wrote back and said, Elsa, beautiful blonde, you know. And Elsa, when we got over to Austria, said, oh, you must come up and spend Christmas with us in Copenhagen. So we were planning to go to Copenhagen for Christmas. And we decided this one weekend there was an offer of a trip, 3-day trip to Paris. So off we went to Paris. And one thing we had been impressed with in Austria was mail service. We got mail twice a day, and it took usually 1 day for mail to go back and forth from any place. So we didn't tell Ed we were coming. It was a very spur-of-the-moment thing. So we go up to Paris and to see Ed. And I'm thinking, okay, I better call him up and say I'm here. And they've given me a handful of coins that I haven't got the faintest idea of what they're worth or anything else. They're French, whatever French currency was besides a franc. But this would fit in the slot, you know, so I put one of these in, and an operator came on, speaking French, strangely enough. And so being American, I understood that if you just spoke loudly to them, they would understand you. So I said, I want to speak to Edward Lehman at Shape headquarters. Well, she could tell by my voice that I was not French. And she got somebody who could speak American. And this sergeant came on, and he said, do you want Shape headquarters at Versailles or Fontainebleau? I had no idea there were two, nor did I have any idea which one Ed was at. So I said, I want to speak to Ed Lehman. Oh, I'm sorry, if you don't know his extension, I can't connect you. But just between you and me, even if you knew it, you couldn't speak to him, he's not here. And I said, okay, thank you. And so we saw Paris, we went home, And we got back to Salzburg, and there was a note tacked to our door, a very angry note. I was here. Where were you, Elsa Marie? Well, we had gone to Paris to see Elsa. Elsa had come from Copenhagen to Salzburg to see us, and a day later we got her letter saying she was coming. It's the first time in the time we were there that I saw a delay in the mail. And Ed had gone to Copenhagen to see Elsa Marie. So that was that. Well, then we signed the peace treaty. And I'm thinking, oh, my job is over here. We have to get out. Where do I go? And we had orders to Italy. And then they canceled it because they didn't have dependent housing. And we had orders to Germany. And then they canceled it because they didn't have dependent housing. And I'm getting closer and closer and closer to the deadline. In fact, I was directing the closing ceremonies for closing the Austrian area command. And I'm watching the ceremony with this eye, with half a dozen RKO and some of the other movie companies, doing all the closing ceremony. This eye, I'm watching my furniture being taken out of my office building on the 3rd floor, put on a truck, be hauled away. And I'm thinking, okay, we still haven't gotten our orders. And then we got orders that says, well, the only place we can send you with housing is back to the U.S. So I immediately contacted Fort Slocum and said, hey, I'm coming home. Can I come back to work? Oh, we're overstrength, and, we haven't got room for you. So they came in. The Army Transportation Corps does a marvelous job of packing. They're swift and efficient, but not too practical. All of a sudden, one morning, there they were. Joan and I were still having breakfast, and they said, we're here to move you. And they just took everything. They just cleaned off the table and packed it. And in the meantime, we had gone up to Birch's Garden and bought Bavarian china that we had been looking at for a long time, and said, okay, it's Rosenthal china. We're going to live on peanut butter and jelly for a while, but we're going to have it. And so we bought, and we couldn't afford even the full service. We had, I think, a 6 or 8 and not everything. And they packed it up. And I was going to haul it down from the china shop to the post office, which was just about a half a block away. And I'm thinking, if they don't hurry up, I'm not going to make the post office. And they finally brought up this cart. Well, when we'd been married, my parents had given us a set of English china for $12, I think it was. It was in a carton about like this. And here I've got a crate bigger than this original carton for like half of it. So I staggered down to the post office, got in just as they closed it, and came out and thought, boy, I'm glad I got rid of that. And I had shipped it back to my mother-in-law's address in Yonkers. And Joan said, they'll have the other crate for you just a minute or two. I looked at her and I said, what do you mean, the other crate? She said, no, it was only half of it. And so sure enough, then out they came with this crate of... So I got it on the bus to go back from Birch's Garden to Salzburg. And I got down to Salzburg, and I had my driver. And we were only supposed to use our drivers on official business. I called him up. I said, Hans, get the Jeep and don't even ask me what it's for. Just meet me at the Bahnhof and take me to the house. And so he showed up with this crate. And so that was part of our household goods that was being shipped. Well, in the meantime, I had written to my mother-in-law saying, this crate is coming to you It's China. So one day the truck comes up in front of her house, bangs on the door. I got a crate for you. All right, we would bring it in, please. So he shoves it off the end of the truck, and my mother-in-law almost went through the roof. She said, "That's China, that's China." And lady, I can't help it, I got a delivery to make, and off he goes. Well, by the time we did finally get home and opened our crate, I think we could have dropped that crate off the top of the Empire State Building and not have a thing broken, because it was so packed and every piece was wrapped. That's why it was so big. But here we are with another crate of furniture, China, and since we had gone over there expecting to be there for a minimum of 3 years, because I was going to be discharged over there and take over the Army Information Agency when I was discharged, some of our furniture was still in transit coming over, and we were coming this way. And we got back, and they said, "We have an opening for you at Fort Dix." I said, "Oh no." So I went back to Fort Dix. Well, it's a little different going back at the command level than at the infantry training basic company. And I was the Adjutant General's files office. And there I worked with a sergeant and several civilians, and we got along fine. So that was where I spent the rest of my time. And while I was there, I worked in the Trenton Public Library, and I met another soldier from Fort Dix I picked up one night. And unless you're a librarian or an artist, it means nothing to you. But he was Ed Emberley. He's written several children's books. His family are artists, and they lived down the street from us. Joan worked in the Trenton Public Library, and that was where we completed our military service.
And have you been in touch with any of those people since you've been out of the service?
I stayed in touch with Eleanor until she died. I stayed in touch with Evelyn McCarthy until she died. I stayed in touch with the Emberleys until a few years ago when we ceased.
Okay, well, thank you very much for telling us your story.